Hi, my name's Alyssa McNamara. I'm the National Lead for Climate and Energy at Dairy Australia. And this webinar will take you through the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, give you some hints and tips on how to use it from a technical standpoint with our expert, Dr Karen Christie Whitehead from the University of Tasmania. In the meantime, and first up, I'm going to give you some context on why Dairy Australia and your dairy levy investments in this space are important to the future of dairying. So, Dairy Australia has a strategic plan for 2020 to 2025, one of the goals of which is to proactively reduce the industry's greenhouse gas emissions. So the graph shows us the milk production and net greenhouse gas emissions over time, back to 2007. And we can see that they are both trending downwards. And we've also seen some pretty significant efficiency gains in the industry over that time, which are also contributing to declining emissions. But really the important thing for you to know there is that the number one thing that drives, or the biggest driving factor in the amount of greenhouse gases we are producing as an industry is really driven by the size of the national herd, which has been declining also over that time. The Australian Dairy Industry Council, which is comprised of the farming and processor peak bodies, also has the Dairy Sustainability Framework in place. That's been in place since 2010. And the industry has agreed through that framework on a whole of industry goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 30% by 2030 relative to 2015 levels. Why do we have these targets and strategy? So climate change is a significant global challenge that the whole world, all sectors, are working on to try and make sure that we limit climate change to impacts that are not going to adversely affect us too much. So there are international agreements, including the Paris Agreement, which is around reducing emissions to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now that might not sound like much, but a small change in the average global temperature does lead to a big change in weather extremes, which, as we all know, can be really impactful for agriculture and for farming. So there's also significant market pressures around community expectations and social licence for the dairy industry to be seen to be doing our bit to contribute. There are emerging financial reporting requirements around climate risk disclosure, which are impacting on large companies, so particularly some of those global processing companies, which are obviously key to the long-term sustainability of the industry. And we've spent quite a lot of time over the last few years really building up our knowledge base in what's happening there. So we've developed the Australian Dairy Farm Emissions Reduction Roadmap to guide our efforts, and this has been developed in consultation with the Dairy Farmers Federation and with the Processors Federation. Now, it's important to note here that dairy represents only about 2% of Australia's national emissions. So there is no suggestion that we need to do all the work that is to be done. There's obviously a lot of industries involved, a lot of community efforts involved in trying to reduce emissions, but it is important that we do what we can to reduce our emissions as an industry and stay sustainable long term. So over the last few years, we've invested a lot in making sure that we've got the research, the evidence, the tools, all those foundational things in place, including the latest updates to the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator. The Dairy Carbon Calculator's been around for almost 10 years. So we're now up to version 5. It's been continually updated in line with all of the international and Australian carbon accounting requirements. And we are strongly encouraging, as a first step, all farmers to know their carbon number. We can't manage what we can't measure, and having more data in this area will assist us to assist you to make profitable changes on your farm that can also reduce emissions. So the first step is knowing your carbon number through the use of the carbon calculator, and then that sets us up for the green phase around short to medium on-term farm measures. So getting those things in place on your farm that are commercially viable and indeed in many cases profitable for your farm, to be more efficient, to source out energy from renewable sources, to maximise the productivity of the farm and the herd, to reduce those emissions profitably. We're also investing in longer term measures, so enteric methane, so that's methane produced by the cows as they ruminate, is the largest source of emissions on Australian dairy farms. And I'm sure you've heard about the feed supplements, particularly seaweed and 3-NOP. There is still quite a bit of work to be done before those methane reduction solutions and others are available and commercially viable, but Dairy Australia continues to invest in those and engage with those companies. I'm now going to hand over to Dr Karen Christie Whitehead to take you through the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator. Thank you.
So hopefully you can see my front cover slide there. Excellent. So as Alyssa said, I'm Karen Christie Whitehead. I got married earlier this year, and I'm still getting used to the double barrel surname. I work for the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, which does all the if you're not aware of it, does all the research, development, extension, has research dairy farms and the like for Tasmania. So we're embedded within the University of Tasmania, but we also work very closely with the state government, our Tasmanian state government Department of Agriculture, look after the regulatory side of agriculture and policy and the like. We do all the RD&E. So just running through sort of my presentation and what I plan to present today is just a bit of an introduction, talk about some of the terminology we use in this space. I'll talk about what's the same and what's different between the 3 carbon calculators or dairy-specific carbon calculators within Australia, some of the limitations of the calculator. I'll then touch on very briefly some overall trends. So the graph that Alyssa put up is, I generated that graph, and it's looking at trends over time from the Dairy Farm Monitor project. I'll touch on, I think, 2 or 3 typical questions I always get asked, and then we'll launch into the standalone Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, which is the Excel standalone calculator. So when we look about carbon calculators and terminology, carbon accounting is when you look at the metrics, so the total sum of greenhouse gas emissions and it's using a unit or a metric of tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum. So you might say my farm produces 5,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum. What's really important is to understand where that boundary is to estimate those emissions, and it's defined as the emissions arising within the operational and organisational boundary of the farm enterprise. So, you know, earlier in the piece I used to get questions, but, you know, I adjust my heifers off farm. Why is that part of my carbon account? It is because it's part of your operational and organisational boundary. You still have ownership of those heifers, even though they're not on your grazing platform. They're part of your farm boundary. They're still emitting, whether they're on your farm or somebody else's farm. Within those total emissions, we have 3 scopes. Scope 1 is your direct emissions. So there's direct sources of emissions and sources of sequestration on farm. They're things that farmers have direct control over. Enteric methane, because depending on how many cows you milk, will determine how much your enteric methane is. Scope 2 are considered indirect emissions from electricity consumption. So you still have a choice in this matter. In some respects, you can choose to put solar panels on your dairy shed and generate some electricity on farm versus taking electricity from the grid. We also have scope 3, which are also an indirect emission source, and they're from things like supplementary feed coming onto the farm, fertiliser and energy. So there's a component of diesel and electricity considered in scope 3 as well as in scope 1 and scope 2. What's important is that when you do a farm account, it doesn't include that downstream emissions. So it's not, you know, including the processing. So if your milk goes off to Fonterra, your carbon account doesn't include the emissions associated with taking that milk from your farm and being processed into cheese or cream or the like. And it's important to understand that, you know, scope 1 emissions on your farm, when your milk leaves the farm, becomes a scope 3 source for manufacturers. In addition to a full carbon account, you also look at a carbon footprint, and usually we use a metric of kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilo of product. So for dairy, it's generally fat and protein corrected milk. It can also be kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of milk solids, for example. If it's other agricultural industries, it might be per kilogram of live weight or kilogram of clean fleece weight, for example. And this carbon footprint includes all those scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So when a farm talks about being carbon neutral or carbon neutrality, it's when all the emissions, so the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, minus any carbon fluxes, so any carbon sinks, carbon sinked into soils and into trees, equals 0. So it's like a cash balance, you know, income in, expenses out. When those equal each other, you are carbon neutrality. So on the left-hand side, we can see greenhouse gas emissions. So they're estimated using the national inventory. And I've just grabbed a screenshot of the Melbourne Uni DGAF tool because its results page are a little bit more condensed than the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator. So that's our source of emissions, our scope 1s, 2s and 3s. Our carbon stocks and our fluxes are either through direct measurement, i.e. you go out and soil sample every year a range of of paddocks, and you can see some direct change in soil carbon over time, carbon stocks. It's important to know that when you're measuring carbon in the soil, that's your carbon stocks. You also can use things like the full CAM model to estimate changes in carbon stocks. But what's important is to understand that when you're doing a carbon neutrality, it's the emissions minus the carbon flux. So you can't say okay, my emissions are 3,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum, and I have across my whole farm 3,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents as soil carbon. They don't take each other out to get to net zero. It's the change in carbon flux year on year, just as the same way it's the change in greenhouse gas emissions year on year that we're accounting for here. So I'll just touch a bit on some results and some bit of a cross comparison. You can say, well, how does dairy compare to other industries? And here we have a pie chart showing dairy across, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, across around 1,775 dairy farms as part of the Dairy Farm Monitor project. The overall average worked out to be about 0.93 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. And I guess as an aside, fat and protein corrected milk, it works out around about a litre. It takes into consideration the fat and protein of the milk to sort of even those two components out. So you can compare a Friesian herd's milk versus a Jersey's herd milk, for example. But as a rough estimate, it's around about a litre. So it's not a kilogram of milk solids. It's about a litre. But you can see enteric methane, which is the biggest component of the pie chart, sits around 57%. And for most farms, it'll sort of sit in that sort of 55 to say 65% of your total farm emissions will be from enteric methane. And then you have your other on-farm sources. So your methane from waste, so that's your dung, your nitrous oxide emissions from the animals and from fertiliser, and then some of your scope 3, electricity, diesel, concentrate and the like. So as I said, the overall average was around that 0.93 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. And to put it into context, we get asked, well, what does that mean? So for a typical farm, if you were producing around about 1 million litres of milk, it would be equivalent to emitting around the same as what 390 return trips on a plane from Sydney to Perth. Driving from Sydney to Perth, doing return trips in your car, it's around about 390 trips per annum. If you were flying from Melbourne to London for 2 people, it's around that 75 return trips. And then we've got sort of to offset those emissions per 1,000 litres of milk, you'd need to plant 60 hectares of blue gums in the West Gippsland, and then sort of some then electricity and diesel. A bit of a cross comparison there. That's in contrast. If we look at the more extensive agriculture, so we've got sheep and beef cattle in the bottom left corner, their enteric methane tends to be a whole lot higher. Sheep sitting around 77%, beef cattle around 82%. And the primary reason is that they don't have as much emissions coming from these other sources. And so the component of their total emissions as a proportion is much larger. In contrast, we've got wheat on the right-hand side, and you can see in this graph, this column graph, that this is wheat from a range of different locations around the country, anywhere from about a 0.2 to about a 0.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilo of grain. So within the calculator, we're saying if you're bringing on a tonne of grain, that's part of your carbon footprint as part of your scope 3 emissions.
So the other important thing to highlight here is that Australian dairy is already one of the world's top performers in terms of having a low emissions intensity for our milk production. And so we are focused, obviously, on trying to retain that performance level. Thanks, Karen.
Yep, that's no problem. And this last sort of graph I've just brought up, it's sort of it doesn't paint dairy in such a good light in terms of our other non-dairy sources. But I always like to keep in mind that dairy is a whole food. These other sources of milk, and I'm not bagging, people have to drink, sometimes they have to drink other sources of milk for a range of reasons, but the nutritional, the denseness of nutrition in dairy milk is much more than those other milk sources that have to sometimes add vitamins and minerals in to be even comparative to dairy-derived milk. So currently there's 3 different Australian-based carbon calculators available in Australia. They're all free and easily downloadable or accessible. I just want to touch on, there are a range of other tools out there that you can just as easily access. For example, the Cool Farm calculator that comes out of the UK. And these tools have some advantages in terms of, say, for example, Fonterra want to be able to compare their supply base in Australia versus New Zealand versus Chile, for example. What's important to know is these other calculators that are derived from out of the country, they do not necessarily contain the Australian emission factors and equations. And I'll touch on that in the next click. Our nearest neighbours across the ditch in New Zealand currently have around 10 or so dairy-specific or dairy calculators that contain dairy within them, and we do not want to go down a similar pathway. And so those tools for the same farm can give quite widely different results, and there's a range of reasons why that's the case, and I won't touch on them today, but it just shows you the dangers of having too many tools out there can be. And here is sort of touching on that sort of middle point of the is that I essentially put the same farm in these 2 calculators. On the left, you've got the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, so has all the Australian inventory, the emission factors, the equations, and then you have the Cool Farm calculator on the right. And what you can see is there's quite a difference in the carbon total. With our calculator, it sits around 3,340 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum, whereas the Cool Farm calculator, if we make that into tonnage, was about 3.35. So, 3,354. So it's quite a bit different, and there's a range of reasons why that's the case, and I won't touch on them either, but it just shows you that the same farm put in 2 different calculators can give you quite different results. So what I'll be showing, in a few minutes' time is the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator. It's a standalone Excel calculator that can be downloaded from the Dairy Australia website. But we also have a carbon calculator embedded within Dairybase, and they're essentially the same. All the equations are exactly the same. How we handle the data is exactly the same. What the Dairybase carbon calculator might require is just a few additional data inputs. For example, things like fuel and electricity consumption needs to go into there. So if you already have a client or you're already talking to farmers that have a Dairybase account and have their farm in Dairybase, that is a quick way to get a carbon assessment. They may need to add some additional data, but it's a quicker way than starting from scratch. What's important is that the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator, so the standalone Excel, has some scope for further exploration of intervention options. And depending on how we go on time, I will touch on some of those in my next bit of the presentation. What we're also doing very, very soon, we'll be able to go, if you've got a Dairybase account and you've got your data in Dairybase and you've already got a baseline for your farm system, you're going to be able to copy the report from Dairybase, import it into the Excel spreadsheet, and then explore some of those mitigation or interventions. And so we're trying to close that gap between those 2 calculators. The Uni of Melbourne also have a DGAF calculator. It's very, very much similar to the two other calculators that are managed by Dairy Australia. Between all three, there's just a slight variation in input data, how stock numbers are determined. There's very, very minor differences, and it might result in, anywhere than, up to maybe a 1% difference in net emissions between those three calculators. They're not, I'm not going to say here and say if you put the same exact data in each three of them, you're going to get exact the same number, but it's going to be darn close versus what happens in New Zealand, for example. The DGAF calculator reports emissions intensity as a kilogram of milk solids, which is a step away from what the ADCC and DBCC do, which is using the kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk. Dairy Australia, and I concur most definitely with this, we encourage users to remain with the Australian developed calculators, and which tool you use depends on, that's a decision for you to make. There's advantages of all three, and there's I won't say there's disadvantage, but there are subtle differences between all three, but we're saying wherever possible, stick to the Australian carbon calculators. And if you do a carbon account over several years, stick with the same tool. Don't use DGAF 1 year and then the Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator the next year, and then the dairy-based carbon calculator the year next, because that very minor subtle difference will then flow through. But with all tools, there's always limitations. Like anything, rubbish in equals rubbish out. This is the case for all tools, not just the Australian tools, but the estimations are quite static. So, farm management doesn't play any part in the estimate. Take, for example, nitrogen fertiliser. A tonne of fertiliser, of nitrogen fertilisers, about 3 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So it doesn't matter if you dump that 1 tonne on 1 hectare in one hit, or you spread it out over the 12-month period. It will still give you that same result. Peter Moat, a few years ago, found that cattle fed wheat emitted significantly lower methane emissions than cows fed the same rate of maize or barley grain. So it's one of the limitations of not necessarily the calculator, but it's a limitation of the whole national inventory, how that's estimated flows through the calculators. There's no ability to estimate soil carbon in any of these calculators, and there's that's another 2-hour presentation in its own right, but primarily because of the spatial and temporal variability in estimating soil carbon. But what's important to know is that, most dairy soils, especially permanent pasture, are already at that carbon saturation point. So there's really little scope for that additional carbon flux of carbon into the soil. Tree carbon sequestration in the calculator is quite crude. Doesn't contain all the potential tree species. It's a lookup table. It's not farm specific, it's more regional specific. But what's important is that trees are really one area of the farm where we can start to also reduce our carbon footprint. Also keeping in mind trees, it's a point of equilibrium where trees plateau in their carbon sequestration year on year. I'll just touch here on a bit of some benchmarking data, and this is from around 1,775 data sets within the Dairy Farm Monitor project from 2006-7 to 2020-21, I think it was. And what you can see, each of those dots is a particular farm over that sort of time frame. And we've got a pretty linear equation. You could argue, well, Dairy Australia just needs to know how much total milk's being produced in the country and go, okay, multiply that number by 0.92 and you can work out what the net emissions are on a total industry basis. But if I focus on these two particular dots and these two particular farms, they're producing around about the same amount of milk production, a bit over 8,000 tonnes of fat and protein corrected milk per annum. This first dot emissions around 6,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, where this second farm, similar milk production and around 10,000. So producing the same product, but vastly different emissions. And so that's where we use an emissions intensity to compare like with like. On the left, we've got the milk emissions intensity across those still same data sets, and you can see quite a range, anywhere from less than 0.5 up to greater than 1.1. But most of the farms are sitting in that sort of range of 0.9 to 0.95. We also have meat emissions intensity, and so again, sort of majority of farms are sitting in this sort of area of the graph. So if we take the average of fat and protein corrected milk and the average of the live weight, with sort of that red point in the middle of the graph. But what we can see, without doing anything that's a silver bullet, like, I don't know, a vaccine to reduce enteric methane or feeding Asparagopsis, we can see there's quite a bit of scope within current farm businesses to reduce both milk and live weight emissions intensity. What are these farms down in this bottom left corner doing really well, and what can the farmers in the top right learn from these farmers in the bottom left to bring everyone's emissions intensity down? And if we can get the industry moving down that slope, the next step was, how do we then bring the whole industry down even further with new technology? Because there's a lower floor that emissions intensity is not getting below because of the biological nature of enteric methane. So I'll just touch on a couple of Q&A questions I frequently get asked. So, why do we include embedded scope 3 emissions in the estimation? Isn't this double counting? Why am I putting the tonne of CO2 equivalent from the tonne of grain that I've purchased? Why is that part of my footprint? And I take it back to the terminology. It's all the emissions arising within the operation and organisational boundary of the farm enterprise. What does that mean? Like, I've made a choice to purchase that tonne of grain, so therefore the emissions are part of my carbon footprint. It's important to know that the national inventory, it does not double count those emissions. It doesn't go, okay, we'll take the emissions from the grain farm, we'll take the emissions from the dairy farm, and we'll double count them. That does not occur. In a similar way, and it works for our advantage as well. If you were selling your heifers, any surplus heifers to China, for example, you shouldn't be responsible for their emissions once they've left your farm. That should lay with China. Likewise, Australia doesn't count the carbon dioxide that's derived from burning coal when it's exported to another country. What it might do on farm might promote practice change. So instead of getting in your tractor and fertilising with a nitrogen-based fertiliser, which has source of emissions associated with the manufacturing of that, you might go, okay, how can I boost the legumes in my pastures? Still get nitrogen into the system, but through a different pathway. Another common question is, why don't I get credit for the carbon I've sequestered in my pastures and my crops? Last year I grew my maize silage grew 12 tonne, and this year I grow 15 tonne of dry matter per hectare. Why don't I get a credit for that tonne of carbon that I've taken out of the atmosphere? And it's right. The more pastures and crops you can grow, the more you can take out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and into carbon into the plants. But what's important is to know that carbon that you've taken out of the atmosphere does not remain in that crop of silage or that pasture. It's not there in perpetual storage like it would be if you took if carbon dioxide came out of the atmosphere and went into trees, for example. That carbon is fed to the cattle, And then a component of that carbon that's fed to the animal then produces methane, and the cycle continues. So it's important to know that that's biogenic methane. It's consistently being broken down into the in the atmosphere, down into CO2 equivalent, to CO2 and water vapor, and the process begins all over again. So the ton of methane that goes into the atmosphere, in 10 to 12 years, it will drop out. It will become CO2 and water, and the cycle continues. In contrast, when we dig coal or out of the ground, it's really new carbon that's going into the system, and it doesn't break down. It remains in the atmosphere for thousands of years. And I'm mindful of time, but this is a really good graph to sort of try and illustrate those two concepts. What we have on the top is over time how our emissions have changed. If we're going rising in emissions with both carbon dioxide and methane, whether our emissions remaining constant or we'll be able to find ways to cut both carbon dioxide and methane over time. And the impact of those three trajectories on global warming. And over time, if we consistently increasing our methane production, it will have a consistent, and these are not to scale, obviously, but you can see that over time, if methane increases over time, so too does the warming effect of that methane. But CO2 carbon dioxide builds upon itself. The ton of carbon dioxide from burning fuel yesterday adds to the ton of carbon dioxide produced today from burning coal, and it just accumulates in an exponential curve. If we were able to keep both constant, if methane in and methane out is constant, we're not adding any more methane to the system, we will get a flatlining of global warming from that methane, but we'll still get an increase in carbon dioxide warming because of that concept of we're adding to what was produced yesterday. What we need to be targeting is falling emissions from both sources. And if we were to get to a point where we're producing no enteric methane, we would have zero effect on warming. In contrast, if we got to a point in time where we're adding no carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it would flatline, but it would never, not in anyone's lifetimes here, start to come down. So I might just pause there and see if there's any pressing questions. And on that, before we then go to the carbon calculator itself.
I can't see anyone's hand up. Oh, wait, there's one. Chris, you had a question.
Yeah, just a quick question, and I'm probably jumping the gun here. You might explain it in a minute, but if, from a practicality point of view, if a farmer was to choose a particular calculator to run with and they download that, they're putting in their data and they're 3 or 4 years along, are we certain that the equations around carbon accounting aren't going to change? And if there is a change, or if there is a need to change that calculator, how are we thinking that we can update that without the farmer having to download a new spreadsheet and update equations and things and re-enter data again?
That's a great question, Asen, and that's where the advantage of the dairy-based carbon calculator really comes into its fore, because that's what we've done over time. We've had a couple of inventory changes, over time, and we've retrospectively gone back and gone, okay, this farm back in 2006-07, what would their footprint look like using today's equations, but the 06-07 farm? And so that would be where that has some advantages over both the standalone Excel calculator and the DGAF calculator. If you were to use the standalone calculators, irrespective of which one that they were, it would be, look, if you've already got a carbon estimate, it would take you 10, 15 minutes max to copy the data across from one Excel calculator to an updated Excel calculator to get that new footprint.
No worries, thank you.
So certainly, Chris, in our broader efforts to increase the adoption of the carbon calculator, that's certainly a key question that we're working through. So what happens to that data after the farmer completes it? If being able to share and understand that data and at an aggregate level is certainly in the interests of Dairy Australia and our program design. But we would be able to account for any changes in the calculations on that level to assist. Back to you, Karen. I can't see anyone else's hand.
So hopefully, Alyssa, you can see the carbon calculator now?
Yeah, all good, Karen.
All good. Just disregard, what I'm going to show you now is version 5.2. It's not been released yet, and I've got a version 5.2 because I found a few typos, essentially. So don't panic that you haven't got 5.2. 5.1 will have exactly the same result as 5.2. So when you download this calculator from the Dairy Australia website, the first thing is a bit of an introduction page, which just, if I zoom in, and we won't take too much time on this, but just gives you a bit of a background information about the tool, where the data comes from, how to enter data, etc., what it can't do, typical disclaimers. And then when you get to the bottom, as I do an upgrade of the calculators, I like to actually just have a sheet here or a component of this front sheet to say, well, what's changed? So, in the past I used version 4 and now I'm using version 5. What's the difference was with that? And if, for example, as I said, between 5.1 and 5.2, there's just a few typos and I sort of clarified electricity inputs, so there's no real changes, no fundamental changes with the calculator. So, if you had an older version and you came and said, oh, there's a new version, what's changed? And if those changes are materialist or like a typo, that's not going to change your results. So there'll be no reason to have to now put your data from 5.1 to 5.2. But if I said in here that, we've changed the emission factors, for example, well, then that would need a change in calculator. What I've done to save time, I've self-populated this baseline farm system. When you open the calculator for the first time, all these white cells will actually be blank and be ready to be entered. So this is just a typical farm. It's not a farm. There's no Bill and Wendy Smith out there, to the best of my knowledge. And if there is, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, Bill. But you just sort of got a bit of, an information at the front end, so who they are, where they're located, and the financial year that you're doing the assessment. It gives you a record to be able to go back and go over time. You can say, oh, yeah, that's that year's records. It's important from the drop-down list, and so the cells are either entry cells, you just enter in the text, or sometimes there'll be these drop-down lists. And for example, this farm is located in Victoria. And what we have also is a drop-down list to quickly look at, and towards the bottom of the sheet, there's a bit of a cross comparison. And so you can actually go in and go, well, I want to compare my results to, I'm in Victoria, I want to compare it to all the other Southwest Victorian data sets. Oh, excuse me. The next section is looking at livestock dynamics, and we've broken it down to the different stock classes. And for a lot of the cells where there's headings, you'll see there's sort of a red triangle in the top right corner, and it has a drop down sort of a comment or a note that pops up that gives a bit of an explanation of, well, what are we considering a milking cow? This is the 12-month assessment. So we wanted to know how many cows are actually in the milking herd for a 12-month period. excuse me, I know in some respects this is the hardest number to wrangle out of a farmer, especially if they're calving year round or they've got split calving. We're trying to focus on how many cows milked for, at a minimum 2 to 3 months in that 12-month period and produced milk that totals up the total milk production that's further in the calculator. So, we're not obviously, yes, it is a hard number to calculate, and sometimes it might be worth, there's plenty of space in different parts of the calculator to make a note and go, okay, Bill might have put a note over here, tried to work out, how I worked out that 450 cows. I worked it out because of X, Y, and Z. And so next year, if he wants to do an estimate next year, he can go back to this sheet and go, okay, well, how did I work out that number? And he's got a bit of an idea of how he came up with that 450 milking cows. These heifers greater than 1 year and heifers less than 1 year, they're your replacement stock. So milking 450 odd cows and retaining around 120 or so heifers of the two age groups. Mature bulls, pretty self-explanatory. Other stock are any non-replacement heifers you've retained on farm, or any steers that you might be taking through to I don't know, 350 kilos or they're retained on farm. And so again, plenty of help messages to help you through that. What we've done with version 5 is we've actually looked at introducing that meat emissions intensity. And so we want to know of all your stock, how much meat has come off the farm. We've now got this column around our calves, and what I ask people to do is, this is your calves, your unweaned calves. So you have to select from the drop-down list, are your calves, your surplus calves that you're not going to retain as replacements or you're not going to fatten up post-weaning, are they sold soon after birth? And by soon after birth, 7 to 14 days, something like that, or are they sold post-weaning? So you might take them through to 100 or 110 kilos and then sell them on to another farm, and they leave your farm business. So they leave your carbon footprint, they leave your farm boundary. And so what we're asking is, how many of those 450 cows that calved, we retained 125 as replacement heifers, and we sold 215 calves post-weaning at 105 kilos. We need to know their live weight and their live weight gain on a sort of live weight as the midpoint of that 12-month period, and live weight gain on a midpoint of that 12-month period. And like the calves that we're selling post-weaning, we need to know how many cows and each age and heifers and bulls and other stock we're selling, and at what live weight they're being sold at, to work out, that total tonnes of live weight that's been sold per annum. The next section focuses on milk production. You can either enter that as litres per herd per annum or kilograms of milk solids per herd per annum. If I go back to what I had done, I said these 450 milking cows produced, and nice, easy, simple numbers, 3 million litres of milk at 4.3 and 3.2% fat and protein, which worked out around about 22 litres per cow per day. If that number was vastly wrong, you need to go then back and check these numbers. Have you got your herd size right? Have you got your milk production right? Have you got this drop down section correct? Excuse me. The next section is what we're trying to ultimately do is determine the overall diet of your milking cow, including her dry period, what the dry matter digestibility and the crude protein of her diet is. So farmers probably, generally have a good idea of how much silage they might feed per day over that 12-month period. They probably have a pretty good feel for concentrate or grain feeding over that 12-month period. Sometimes pasture intakes are a little bit harder to know. And so what we do, we give the people the ability, we know they're getting about 4 kilos from silage and concentrate. And over in this left-hand side, we have a bit of an estimate. So for these cows to produce around that 22 litres of milk per day, they need around 16.7, 17 kilos of total feed per day. And so we can go, okay, we're getting 4, we need 17, so we'll get 13 from pasture. Again, all this is trying to determine is these two values. The calculator itself will work out actually how much feed the animals, each class, how much they're consuming. Unless we've got some defaults for our other stock, so that's our heifers, our steers, our bulls, anything but the milking cow. And I always suggest leaving, and we've got in the help messages, I'm pretty sure, yeah, we do. Just these are sort of ballpark defaults. That might be slightly high. You might go, okay, it's 70 and 20, and that's across all those other stock classes. In terms of fertilisers, again, we've got a bit of a drop-down list. Tons of element. So here we're talking about tons of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. We're not talking about tons of urea or tons of MOP, for example. So you can either enter as kilograms of element per hectare per annum, and if you go down that option, you need to fill in how many hectares you fertilised. It is much simpler if you can get your farmers to work out, well, how many tonnes of nitrogen did I apply to my crops and to my pastures in that 12-month period? What we also need to know is what percentage of that 55 tonne was actually urea versus other nitrogen-based fertilisers like DAP, for example, because that has a source of carbon dioxide associated with urea N fertiliser versus other non-urea N fertilisers. And then we have our PKS and lime or dolomite for our pastures and our crops. So if you can use tonnes of element per annum, that's great. If you have to go down the kilograms per hectare per annum, you need to fill in the area so we can multiply the area by the rate to end up with this tonnes number. Electricity consumption, we want to know how much electricity you purchased from the grid. If you're, for example, you had solar panels on the dairy and you're feeding electricity back into the grid, we no longer account that in these estimates. We just want to know how much electricity you've purchased from the grid and where that's come from. You've got basically two options. It's either all come from the grid or it's 100% renewable. So down the line, if the power that a farmer is purchasing, 100% of that is renewable, it would come with a zero footprint. But say, for example, you're in Victoria, you're purchasing 175,000 tonnes of kilowatt hours, but your supplier tells you, I can guarantee that 10% of that is coming from renewables. You would enter 10 in this cell. It will then multiply that 175 by 0.9, so it will bring it down 10%, so that the footprint is just based on 90% of that 175,000 kilowatts of power. The other energy consumption is diesel consumption or unleaded fuel. You can add the two of them together. And this is another area that sometimes a lot of farmers will say, oh, yeah, I have quite, I don't know, a dairy farm says I only use 10,000 litres on farm, but then you find out they actually use contractors to do some or all of their field work. And so we've just got some approximate consumption numbers. So And a bit of an example. So, you know, for every hectare of fertilising, it's around 3 litres of diesel, etc. I won't go into too much more, but there's obviously that help message there. Purchase supplementary feed, pretty self-explanatory. How much hay and silage and grain concentrate was purchased for the 12-month period. Carbon sequestration, as I said earlier, it's a fairly crude. If there's no trees on farm, you just leave it as those that zero or no estimate of carbon sequestration. Say if you did have some trees on farm, you then have to choose your region. And so we said in Victoria, we're in the southwest. If at the top you said you're from New South Wales, well, then that drop-down list would just have options that are New South Wales-based. There's a selection of different species for that region. If the farmer says, I have a species that's not present there, then select the mixed species. We have 2 soil types here, but to be honest, they don't really make much difference to the results, and in a lot of respects, they don't make any difference. So you could choose either of those. We need to know the area of the farm with these trees and the age of the trees. If you had a farm, you're doing a farm audit and they've got sort of 2 parcels of trees. They've got 10 hectares of trees that are 5 years of age, and they've got another 5 hectares of trees that are about 15 years of age. You'd have to work out a weighted average. There's 15 hectares of trees, but the average of that might be, 8 years of age. Always enter this as a whole number. If you put in a point, 7.5, it'll fall over. So always enter as a whole number. If, for example, the farmer actually used, say, for example, the Look-See calculator that's out there, that's a CSIRO-based tool, and they've worked out that their particular farm can sequester 6 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare per annum, you would enter that number in that cell there. And that would then override these other numbers. This will be the last section of the data entry. And so manure management. The default in the calculator is using these state-based factors and fractions. So the National Inventory has worked out for across all of Victoria, they've worked out that on average, the manure, around 11 to 12% of all the manure deposited by the dairy cow ends up in an anaerobic lagoon. It has a small fraction to these other components because some farms might actually use a sump dispersal system, or it might drain to the paddock. So a sump and dispersal might be you then spread it out through your irrigation. You've got a little fertiliser spreader, and so you're spreading it around different parts of the farm. Drain to paddock means that it drains to the same area of the farm every day. Solid storage is if you're doing some composting of your waste. So, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but if you're a composting barn, for example, or you have, when you flush the manure and the water from the dairy to go to an anaerobic lagoon, you've got some sort of form of weeping wall or solids trap. That's what the consistency of that manure is in that solid storage component. And when you subtract the amount of manure from all these other 4 sources, it works out how much of that total manure goes onto pasture. And so that's those numbers are pretty good for a typical farm that the cows might stay in the dairy, say 3 to 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time they're out on pasture. But what we're seeing more and more so with PMR or TMR type farms, that cows are spending more and more time off pasture. And so if a farm is spending a lot more time off pasture, then around about that 3 to 4 hours per day, we're highly suggesting you use the user-defined fractions. And what that means is you go through and you answer all of these questions for the particular farm. Now, a farm that might actually only keep the cows off pasture for, say, 2 hours a day would benefit by using the user-defined factors and fractions, because a lot more of their manure would end up on pasture. So each of those questions, again, there's a lot of help messages around all of those. So what we're trying to do is we're not looking at how long the cows are at the dairy as the total herd. So, for example, if a big farm that's milking 2 herds 3 times a day, the dairy is actually going pretty much 24/7. We're wanting to know what's that would be not what we're trying to capture. We're trying to say, of all the manure of a cow, how much of that is being captured in these other systems versus going to the pasture. So, for example, I know the cows, we're trying to find that midpoint. So if the cows are at the dairy for 2 hours morning and night, but the first cows are released from the dairy and go back onto pasture after 30 minutes of being pulled out of pasture, versus the last cow that takes 2 hours to come off pasture and get back onto pasture, we're talking about that midpoint. So that mid cow would be at around 1 1.25 hours off pasture. I know that's I could spend a lot more time, and I must say, while we're at it, we have actually got a manual associated with this calculator now. That's a new thing that we have got, and I go into a lot more detail in that manual. So between the manual and some of these drop-down lists, we're trying to work out that midpoint. So of that 24-hour period, how much manure is on pasture versus the different systems. So let's say, and I'll just, at the moment, I haven't got any data in there, so we'll go back to the default and we'll just look at how those results look. And so what we've broken down the results into is all the different sources and the different stock classes, as well as fertiliser. And we can see for this particular farm, when we add up all those emissions, they're sitting at around 3,580 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. We don't have any trees on farm. Well, I thought we did. Because we're using other tools, sorry. So I'll go back to here. We do have trees on farm. They've sequestered around 78 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So we're getting around 3,500 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And we've broken those down into a fat and a protein. Fat and protein corrected milk emissions intensity, a milk solids emissions intensity, and then also informed you as what's the emissions intensity per kilogram of live weight. If I quickly, and I'll be very quickly because I know we're very quickly running out of time, if we had user defined and we said actually the cows are spending 4 hours per day and 305 days per annum. What we wanted to know here, it was trying to define ultimately how much is going to the lagoon. So if all the waste is going to the lagoon, it would be 0 and 0, and the balance is going to the lagoon. If, for example, you had everything was flushed and drains to that one paddock day on day, and that was 100%, well, that means nothing is actually going to the lagoon. It's all draining to the paddock. But we'll go back and say this actual farm has a pond system and all the manure from the dairy is being flushed to that pond. The next question is, do you pre-treat the waste? So examples are like a weeping wall, a solids trap, some sort of mechanical separator, and you have a drop down of no or yes. So we'll say, for example, this farm does have a weeping wall or a solids trap, and so around 20% of the manure is actually going into that solid storage consistency. And then this number would have dropped down proportionally. The next question is around hours per day and days per annum that the milker is spending on a feed pad or housed in the case of TMR type farms. And we'll just say for this particular farm, actually, no. Actually, sorry, we'll say yes. We'll say they're on a feed pad for an hour a day, but that's for, I don't know, 50 days per annum. And then we ask that question again, how is that manure handled? Like, it might still go to any one of those three systems. It might still be flushed and drained to the paddock. It might be spread daily through a system. It might go to your pond lagoon system. But now we have this fourth option, which is scraped and stockpiled. And so this, again, becomes that sort of solid storage consistency. What's important, what I couldn't code within the calculator, is that we need the hours per day and the hours per day here to add up to 24. If you go over 24, it can't give you an error message, and so it will overestimate. So your farm might have, this is the, they might have a composting section that might be a total TMR farm, and the waste from the dairy goes to a pond lagoon system, but then from the composting barn, it's the balance is actually in that sort of solid storage consistency. But for the purposes of this, we'll just go back to these numbers. And then we also ask that same question of heifers. Now, we're not worried about, you're pulling the heifers into the dairy, onto concrete, 3 times a year to do some vet checks or the like. We're talking, this is really for anyone that houses heifers in the same way they house their milking cows. But it's the same process, hours per day, days per annum, and how is that manure handled. And what we're seeing for this particular farm, by using these user-defined, this value, if anyone was astute, I think this was around, we can find out quickly. That was 3,500. By actually entering their own data, I think it's come down a tad. And sorry for moving everyone around quickly. It has come down slightly. So this is an example where using the user-defined actually was a positive outcome for this data assessment. And then we just give a bit of a typical, we look at what your farm assessments look like. So enteric methane sitting around 57% and the different sources of emissions. And then this typical average is that Southwest Vic figure, and you've picked that up because right at the very top, we said we wanted to compare with Southwest Vic. You might have said, actually, I want to compare with Australia-wide, and how does my farm stack up versus Australia-wide? Actually, not that much different. So that's your baseline calculator. Then when you open this calculator, all of these cells, as I said at the start, will be blank. But what I've done is very quickly, I've got a default farm here, and this sheet is actually protected, but it gives you an example farm. We then have, and it will be very quickly, Alyssa, 2 seconds. We then have the ability to look at a range of different intervention options, which feed some of the data from that baseline farm come through, and then you can quickly look at some of the variables that will affect the farm performance. So if I had a vaccine that reduced enteric methane by 30% and it cost me $5 per cow, how much change in milk production you might be, and it can do a very quick cost analysis of that. And that's very rushed through. lots of information in the manual. So if in doubt, look at those drop down sort of those help messages, look at the manual, look at the example baseline farm, talk to your colleagues, talk to us. We'll get you there. So, questions?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. We have this meeting scheduled until 1 o'clock.
Yep.
And so the idea was to leave plenty of time for your specific questions. You know, I've got this farmer that does this particular farm management practice with his feed or whatever. I don't, like, how would I handle that in the calculator, or how does it do X, Y, Z? So does anyone have any questions? I'll have to get you to raise your hand, otherwise I won't see who it is. But who wants to kick off?
I have a couple. I'll go.
Go right ahead.
Karen, I just noticed in there's dry matter digestibility percentage, and I've found when I've had to play with these and doing some stuff with farmers that some of them don't actually have that figure. Tends to be pretty common. Yeah.
Great point, and thank you. Like anything trying to rush through this, I've missed a couple of really critical things. If in doubt, we've got this click here to help regarding this feed quality button. And, okay, don't know what that, and I'll just make this slightly bigger so that you can see it on screen. What we have is some typical, and this was taken from feed test, some, you know, non-forage and forager species. So we got, you know, your grains and the like on the top, and then you got your hays and silages, and we've given some dry matter digestibility in terms of average but range, you know. So, you know, you might go, actually I feed canola meal and I have no idea what it is. This is a fallback for, okay, canola meal, it's say 78% dry digestibility. Or they might say, look, I know the ME, but I don't know what the digestibility is. We've built this in this yellow section. So they might go, okay, I know my grain is 13.2 megajoules per kilogram of dry matter. The estimated DMD is 89% now there. Or it's, you know, I don't know, 10.5 because it's a good silage. It's around 72%. So that gives you an option. If in doubt, you can use that sort of table, or if you have an ME value. I have had someone suggest, could we actually on the calculator at the front on the baseline sheet have it as an ME as opposed to DMD? It's something to consider moving forwards. But yeah. Or you might have, you know, 2 or 3 grains, and we've only got one cell for concentrate and grain. So you might go, okay, I'm filling some wheat, I'm feeding some lupins. What does that work out as a weighted average? And then even though we've got sort of 6 components here, you know, you might have one lot of silage. So this might be grass silage, but you might have some maize silage as well. So you might actually go, okay, instead of being hay, you could change that to be your maize silage as well in that respect. At the back end, concentrates, we've said, you know, for every tonne of concentrate that comes on, it has an emission factor. Hays and silages have a different emission factor, but it's the same between hay and silage. And byproducts we've assumed comes on with no footprint. You said you had a second question, Heidi?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for answering that first one. That's great. The second one was, why did it change from with your energy consumption? Why did they get rid of the percentage grid, percentage renewable, that split? Because a lot of people do have that. So I'm just wondering why they're changed to 0 or 100%.
You mean?
Yeah, down there you said you either had to pick 100% renewable, or was it 100% on the grid?
It can be 100% on the grid, but you can still then deduct it by a certain percentage. So you might say, I don't know, I forget the name of the company, but we'll call them Red Spot, for example. You know, they're supplying you energy, but they've guaranteed that 50% of their electricity that they're producing, that they're selling to you, that's come from renewables, it's come from hydro, or it's come from a wind farm. And so even though it's state grid, you're sourcing it from the grid, 50% of it is actually coming from a renewable source. Therefore, type in 50 in that cell that I'm currently in, and that will reduce how much emissions associated with the grid source that's non-renewable.
Cool. Thank you.
In the same way thank you, great questions. In the same way we've got that feed quality, we've also got a similar thing for fertiliser, and I'll just zoom in as well a little bit bigger. So it gives you some of the more typical fertilisers and the typical composition of them. So you might go, actually, I'm applying 100 tonnes of urea. It will then work out that that's equivalent to 46 tonnes of nitrogen or and then I've got spreading 100 tonnes of DAP, has nitrogen, has phosphorus, has a bit of sulfur. If you scroll down to the bottom, it will give you then that breakdown. So we need to know it's 18 tonne of nitrogen, 20 tonne of phosphorus, and 1.6 tonne sulfur. You could then copy those numbers across to the baseline sheet in these appropriate cells. But because that was DAP, there was 0 urea. Any other curly questions?
Yeah, can I ask one, Karen, from Gippsland? And it's probably extending a bit on from what you've been sort of talking about, Karen. It's been great to sort of get, such detail on this. It's probably now more a question maybe for Alyssa and Kathy. Just what are we envisaging is going to be delivered as part of the extension pilot? Is it sort of almost something similar to what we've done today? Is it, what are we envisaging is going to be some of the content around? And I know it's still piloted and stuff, but just be great to get an idea of what that looks like.
I think that one's for you, Kathy, in terms of your thinking around WA, and then I'll talk about broader where we're going nationally.
Sure. No worries. So I guess the main outputs that we're going to achieve with the pilot is really around just the baselining with the farmers, so getting that milk pool baselined with every individual farmer in WA. So priority number 1 is getting them just to run through this calculator so that we have their numbers, and then we'll collate that information. Along the way, though, I'm doing, and Steve, who's on the line too, Steve Hosson, g'day Steve, don't know if Sarah's on as well today, but I guess the next step from that is also we're gathering a bit of intel as well from the farmers as well around what their understanding is in terms of, have they done this before? What kind of information are they looking for? Getting a feel for what kind of activities they're doing on farm. From that, we're trying to get an idea, and I'll collate all the information once we've got our big bulk of data at the end, is looking at where within that original graph that Karen put up, where the bulk of our Western Australia farmers sit. So are they at the lower end of the scale? Are they at the higher end of the scale? What are the trends that we're seeing between the different farming systems? What can we learn from what they're doing? And the ones that are really kicking the goals, how can we apply that and use those learnings and roll them out in, on-farm activities, discussion groups, any trials or testing? And that's really the next step, though. So that'll be from July onwards next year. In terms of supporting, obviously, extension team and things like that, I'm looking to do further rollout of workshops, so small groups and also some one-on-ones with anyone who's interested. And I'm just in the process of developing that resource at the moment, so not quite ready yet for that. Does that answer your question?
So
yeah, sorry, yeah, finding the mic. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Thanks, Kathy.
So the other thing that it's important to acknowledge is that the knowing your carbon number has benefits for farmers, but it also, as we kind of talked about before in the drivers, has broad benefits, also to processors and other parts of the supply chain. So as Dairy Australia, so not just me, had a great conversation actually with Dave Nation about this just this morning before this meeting. We are really looking to significantly ramp up what I'm referring to as the hug around farmers to help get this done. So how do we harness some more resources so it's not just Kathy or even just Kathy and Steve that are working on this? How do we make sure that those who benefit from this work and knowing your carbon number across the supply chain are also contributing resources, including governments, right? So state and federal governments all have emissions reduction targets and strategy and international commitments. So they are also beneficiaries of work that dairy is doing in this space. So I don't have anything concrete to tell you. All I can tell you is that those discussions are happening. Did anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask?
Steve from WA, if I can.
Go ahead, Steve.
Earlier in the presentation of data, we had a similar amount of fat and protein, similar amount of beef sales farm with 40% difference in CO2 emissions. Why? What's the key drivers behind that number difference?
Yep, I've done it. Put $1 in the jar because I just didn't unmute myself. It will be, and I must admit, Steve, I just put that up very late last night and I didn't look at it, but it'll be things like herd size. And I'll just give you an example. Say this farm, and what we have, I'll click on here. What we will do, we'll just change a tad of information here. What I've got in the spreadsheet is actually I'll change a few more things. We have a strategy farm. We will go to that. That is an exact replica of the baseline farm, and I'll just zoom in. And it is exact. All the cells at the moment are white because they're an exact replica of that baseline farm. So, but if we said this farm, the biggest source of your on-farm emissions is enteric methane, and it's your milking cow. So if instead of producing 22 litres per cow per day, we were milking, I don't know, say 50 less cows. And so what I have told people with the strategy farm, they're already, the baseline farm, as you can see, maybe you can't because it's quite small on your screen, but when you click on this cell, you can see it's the baseline farm and it's referencing back to the baseline farm. I always tell people to then add or subtract whatever you want to do so that you're still retaining that equation, and you can then go back and delete that additional. So I'm saying instead of milking 450 cows, we're milking 400 cows. Everything, assuming everything else stays the same, and they're staying the same because all the cells are remaining white, whereas in this cell has gone now to red to change, to indicate there has been a change. we're actually reducing emissions by 124 tonnes of CO2 equivalent just by milking 50 less cows. So making our cows getting more milk production per cow. So it can be things like, same amount of milk, that hasn't changed, but we've got less cows. Now that was only 100 and odd tonne. It wasn't that, almost 4,000 tonne difference. So it could be there's actually a lot more fertiliser going in, but they're not converting their resources, their fertiliser or their water. They're not converting their cow, the resource, which is a cow, into milk production. And so there's less milk to dilute emissions, which will make it a higher emissions intensity, but also make it a higher total net emissions. So without digging into why those two particular farms are sitting quite differently on the scale, there could be a range of reasons. I would suggest primarily it's probably herd size and that milk production per cow.
Thanks for that.
And apologies, I should have actually, done some homework and actually worked out, when I was pulling those two farms out, why are they so different, which would have helped this conversation.
All right. Matthew, next with his hand up.
Oh, hi. Matt Hall from Gipps Dairy here. I just wanted probably less of a question and more of a comment about increased milk production per cow. I think we need to be very careful with that message. It's not just as simple as milking less cows and getting more milk production. There's a number of management steps that I just want to flag this for the REOs. And I know we're not all this, but not all that simple in terms of we're just going to assume it, but this calculator will. So we need to be really careful when we're using it. If you're trying to demonstrate to a farmer you can reduce your methane emissions by getting more milk, it's not just as simple as to say, let's just get more milk. There's a bit to getting more.
Most definitely, Matthew. And I didn't want to say that it was as simple as that, but it gave me a chance to show you that strategy farm and try and understand where those differences are. There's a lot of things into play, but one of the abilities when I looked at those around 1,700 odd dairy farm monitor project data sets is I could start to tease out and what are those key differences between farms that actually result in a lower emissions intensity. And what was really clear is that the more milk production per cow, if you can start getting cows closer and closer to that sort of rule of thumb of producing a kilogram of milk solids per kilogram of live weight, the closer and closer you can get to that point, the lower emissions intensity tends to be for the farm. Now, there's a lot of things in play there. If you're burning your cows out, and so you're having to have a lot more replacements because you're really pushing the cows a lot harder. You're having issues with reproductive performance and the like, mastitis, more cull cows, etc. Well, that's going to work against you. You've got to try and, it's like this is a finely tuned engine. So you've got to look at those issues not issues, but the components of the farm, the levers that will actually change the net result. And taking a step sideways, as I touched on in some respects earlier, it's a very crude, this calculator of itself is quite a crude implement. It doesn't take those subtle differences into account. For example, two cows that might be eating 20 kilograms of feed per day, one's producing 20 litres and the other's producing 25 litres a day. Unfortunately, the calculator goes, oh, that cow's producing more litres, therefore she must have eaten more feed, therefore her enteric methane goes up. It's one of the legacies of using a national inventory that is a downfall of using a national inventory to build an actual farm calculator, in that it's not dynamic in nature. And so, yeah, there's a few things in play happening there, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I agree with you. I've got no doubt about the science of more milk per cow gets less methane. It's just making sure that we understand the complex interactions that farmers would have to carry out to get that, and it needs to have a reasonable business case sitting next to it for a farmer. And I think that's part of the extension piece that is sort of around Karen McLennan's question a little bit earlier, perhaps. But anyway, thank you very much for your answer on that.
Yeah, and look, it's like anything, knowing your numbers, looking at your herd and going, can I, for this particular year, I've got a lot of heifers coming through, can I afford to cull a little bit harder, and going, okay, what are some of those cows that I'm putting the same amount of feed down her mouth, but she's not giving me as much milk production as her colleagues or her herd mates, and so how can we start to make look at those inefficiencies on farm, and both methane and nitrous oxide are a result of in some respects an inefficiency on farm. How can we get the maximum amount of our fertilizer so that we're putting the nutrients on that we need and harvesting that pasture as best we can to get into the cow, into milk production, and then off farm. And so it could be things like soil testing. So it's putting on more urea is not going to give you more pasture because you've got an acidity problem or you've got a phosphorus problem. And so it's knowing all the different components of a farm and trying to fine tune every aspect of the farm to maximise the outputs for those inputs, for those resources, whether that's water, cows, pastures, your labour. They're all inputs, and so trying to maximise them in a very environmental and economic lens is going to help reduce your emissions and emissions intensity.
And just to build on that point, we, obviously we have some farmers who are extremely motivated by what's happening in the environment as a part of their thing, and they might be very specifically interested in what they can do right now to reduce their emissions. But the purpose of the calculator and farmers doing their doing their carbon number is to get them ready for, when people are asking for this number and being a bit ahead of the curve on that part. But also that this is another piece of information that can help them to understand their business. It is absolutely not meant to be taken in isolation. It still comes down to, we still need to balance, as we've discussed, human health and well-being for the staff, the health and well-being of the animals, the business decisions that make sense for farmer profitability. So this is another tool in the toolbox that can really assist with that.